I appreciate the opportunity to put these questions. Thank you, and thank you for your presentations. I first would like to ask to speak to the Commission, please, and to ask you, are you aware, I don't know if you're employed there since 2012, but are you aware that in 2012 Michael O'Leary attacked the regulator for being overstaffed, overpaid, and claimed that Ryanair were a victim of your agency? And if you were aware of that, and what your comment would be on that. So, in other words, 5 years ago now, he saw your regulating agency as a problem, and clearly nowadays it doesn't appear to be a problem, because all of you who speak on behalf of the agency have talked about the sort of partnership and the harmonious relationship and the attempt to work with Ryanair, the attempt to solve the problem. But there's no tone of the attempt to, which I believe is one of your briefs, to implement and apply regulation. There's no tone that that is what you actually try to do with Ryanair. And this is why everybody is making the comparison between yourselves and the CAA in Britain, because the head of the CAA, Andrew Hayne, has made a mark really here, and previously had been accused of light touch regulation by pilots' associations and trade unions in Britain. But my God, he stands out markedly beside the record of your agency by insisting that Ryanair did in fact comply with the regulation and did in fact inform the passengers that they were entitled to be rerouted on other airlines. And Mr Hayne has said that in his discussion with Ryanair, in some discourse with Ryanair, Michael O'Leary said to him he is not going to pay for passengers to fly on other airlines. That's against the law. Now, that's a regulation that passengers should have known, that they were entitled to be rerouted on other airlines. And you quoted a lot about the emails that Ryanair sent out and how you had to go and discuss with them and change the language a bit and make the message a bit different. At any stage, did you insist that in that email that they point out to passengers very clearly what the British regulator forced them to point out under threat of enforcement, which is that passengers were entitled to be rerouted on other airlines? Or do you interpret that regulation differently to the CAA? There's a couple of questions just on that. I would also like to agree with Deputy Barry and to say that there's been a shocking low level of light touch regulation in this country on the question of Ryanair. And really, it's summed up for me by Mr Hayne when he says the compliance culture in Ryanair only appears when they're forced into the courts. Their compliance culture is wanting otherwise. And I would like you to comment on that. And I'm not asking you to tear apart Mr Hayne, obviously, but I would like you to comment on those very serious allegations by your counterpart in Britain. For yourselves in the Aviation Authority, you see, at one stage you said that the issue of pilots' contracts has nothing to do with you, it's for someone else. Well, I want to put it to you that it has very much something to do with you, because you have to oversee the health and safety regulations, or the safety at least, of people's participation in flights, both the pilots, the airline themselves, and indeed the passengers, the likes of all of us sitting around and those who may be watching. We would be very concerned that our flights are run safely. And there's a number of issues here to do with the contracts of pilots that you don't seem to think has anything to do with you. And it goes to the heart of why, for 10 years after the regulation was brought in 2008, almost 10 years, Ryanair did not apply the regulation of the annual leave year running from January to December. And you speak to any trade union in the airline industry, and indeed any of the pilots' associations, which we will earlier on, and they will tell you that the 900 hours that were declared safe to work in a year, in a period, were being worked by Ryanair between March and April. Between April and March, excuse me, the other way around. And most of those hours were being packed into the summer. And then hardly any hours were given to pilots in the winter. So you see a big concentration of Ryanair flights in the summer period and an awful lot of them do not exist during the winter period. Hence Deputy Barry's comment about the type of contract under which pilots work. Now, are you aware of a London School of Economics study carried out with 7,000 pilots across Europe, which is basically looking into pilot fatigue, and where they point out that the type of contract under which pilots work, whether it's precarious, whether it's permanent, or how the hours are managed, very much impacts on the safety of the airline, because pilot fatigue is a problem. If you're not aware of that study, I would recommend that the Aviation Authority makes themselves aware of that study, because it's a very highly recommended study, very comprehensive, as I say, carried out among 7,000 pilots across Europe. The other issue to do with the notification that Ryanair gave, you probably are aware of this, and maybe you could answer for me if you are, that last June they wrote to their pilots and told them, that was June 2016, that they would have to change the leave year around because of this regulation being imposed on them. And it's my understanding from conversations with people in Europe that it was the European Aviation Safety Authority leaned heavily on you guys to make sure that regulation was implemented. Now, I'd like you to comment on that. You talk about discussions with EASA, but I would argue, and I've been told, that they lean quite heavily on you. And it would seem that they may have had to, because after 10 years, Ryanair and Aer Lingus were the only ones not applying this rule of January to December leave years, and the operation within the 900 hours within that year. So Ryanair told their pilots last June that they were going to apply this, and yet they went ahead and published their 2017 summer schedule. Did it not occur to the Aviation Authority at any point, there's a problem here? These are coming up against a deadline to apply this regulation, and yet they've published their 2017 summer schedule, winter schedule, sold a load of flights. What is going to happen? Now, that I wouldn't say is micromanagement. I would say that you should have been alerted, given the serious change they had to make in terms of the leave year. You should have been alerted automatically to there will be a problem, and this will be a problem for passengers and for health and safety. The responsibility for passengers and their complaints lies with the body that sits beside you, but surely there must be some indication somewhere along the line that these things matter. If they don't, then maybe Michael O'Leary's complaint about being overpaid is fair enough. One other point on health and safety: are you aware of a table of I see now how it's phrased. I better get this right. A secret table detailing Ryanair's tracking of pilots' fuel use was sent to the Minister for Transport some months ago. Are you aware of that? Has the Minister for Transport discussed this with you? Are you concerned at all that there may be pressure put on pilots to fly with less fuel than would otherwise be the norm? Because flying with less fuel makes the flight more economical. You don't spend as much fuel carrying the weight of the fuel itself. And are you aware of any complaints or petitions from pilots in Ryanair to say that they were concerned about being pressurised to cut down on the amount of fuel they carry? If you weren't aware of it, now that I've made you aware of it, are you concerned about that? Does that ring alarm bells with you? And therefore, would you be concerned that the safety of not just the pilots, with the hours I talked about and the fatigue that kicks in, but also the safety of the pilots and the passengers they carry is being compromised because of these shoddy practices? Finally, I just want to ask you one other question, and I'm sorry now for being slow. I have loads of notes here. Just on that period of you gave them a deadline until January 2018 to get their act together, but yet you said you gave them a year, and still they informed their own pilots last June that they had to do this. So that would be a year this June. You gave them more than a year. You gave them almost 2 years, because you had those discussions in February of 2016. You gave them almost 2 years. They failed to comply in a proper way, and then they make a bags of it or a mess of it according to themselves. And does this not give you concern as the Civil Aviation Authority about the behaviour of this company, the impact on health and safety, and indeed the impact on the, I think it's nearly 700,000 passengers now who have been impacted. My God, if Bus Éireann or Dublin bus unions did that, the sky would fall in, according to wider society. It'd be an awful thing to happen. But this happens because of the behaviour of a company, and there's hardly a word of criticism. So I think the question of light touch regulation and backing off from Ryanair and having discourse with them rather than imposing regulation on them is a problem with both authorities, and I'd like you to comment on that.
Could I just say, before those questions are answered, I just want to make the point, and I think in fairness, that in terms of your allegation of light touch regulation, the facts are that you're not required to be informed is not the issue. So therefore, the light touch regulation is in this House. We make the regulations, or we make the laws. So in that respect, that's something we have to address.
Absolutely, Deputy, absolutely. And evidence, Ryanair's addressing the breakfast of Fine Gael last year, and you all clapping them and telling how wonderful he was.
No, I wasn't at that event. You'll be glad to hear, nor was I there this morning for
Deputy, that was at it. They all deny it.
I welcome you to this meeting. I welcome you to this committee meeting. And I just ask you, I didn't interrupt you, and I'm trying to be fair to you, and fair to the witnesses as well. So I just want to repeat again, it's the point that Deputy Munster made actually before you, which I agree with, that we need in this House to get our act together in relation to changing the regulation. So it's not your fault that the regulation is there, because they weren't required to inform you in the first place what they were doing. They should have. They had a moral, they had an ethical obligation. They didn't do that. But we must address that point. But the other charges you make are very serious, and obviously I'd like them to be responded fully, and I'll take it from whoever wishes to do so. But they are very serious, I think, certainly in relation to safety issues.
I have a number of comments to make, and I think David's going to come after. He has a few things to say as well. What I said about Ryanair taking their eye off the ball, that was absolutely in no way an excuse for their behaviour. I was wondering why they did not come to us in advance, and why they got the message. Then they did get the message out about care and assistance, about rerouting, and about the right to compensation, but the rerouting wasn't clear enough. So I will give you 100% assurance that we will, like every other enforcement agency in Europe, hold them fully to account in relation to the enforcement of the regulation. We will be looking at how they deal with their claims. Any claims that come to us, we will be looking at the rights of the passenger as outlined in that regulation. And as we mentioned earlier, we will be talking with our European counterparts to make sure, for as far as possible, we apply a consistent approach, and that includes the CAA as one of the enforcement bodies. And so that's what we will do. And at the end of that process, we will also just review Ryanair's
performance. I'm sorry, because the chairperson has said that the problem is not with your lack of regulation, it lies with this House. No,
it's a different...
but you have the power to regulate and to tell Ryanair to inform their passengers that they're entitled to reroute on another airline. Is that correct?
We have the rights to, we have the duty, I guess, to ensure that they provide the passengers with adequate information to make a decision. And that's what we were doing.
So ultimately, can you say that that would include ensuring, as the CAA did, that Ryanair inform passengers that they have an entitlement to be rerouted on other airlines?
We're getting into the details of the exact wording of what the CAA considers to be in line with the European regulation, and what we may do, because it's open to some small degree of interpretation. So I don't want to get into the exact wording, but in principle, I accept that, and I fully support that Ryanair should look at using other airlines when they're looking at the decision of rerouting. But they had this in place.
Could you just answer me yes or no? Do you agree with the CAA?
Deputy, I just want to give the witness an opportunity to respond.
But she's not answering my question.
Well, I want to hear her further. You can come back if you're not happy, but I just want to hear complete her sentences if I can.
Yeah, so in terms of the enforcement notice they issued, they're very specific in what they want Ryanair to do, and that was their interpretation. But obviously, all member states make their interpretations, and sometimes there's subtleties around words and meanings, and that was their interpretation. So all I can say is, by the end of that process, the wording that we agreed with Ryanair, in our view, was compliant with that European regulation. Second point was in terms of taking the eye off the ball, and the comment was it was purely a profit maximisation exercise. But I don't. That's not within my remit, so I don't know. But the only observation I'd make there was, if I was a profit maximiser, I would have come out much earlier and told people about the cancellations. That would save me more money. Because if you give less than 14 days notice of the cancellation, you're required to pay compensation. And I think Ryanair estimated something around 25 million, I think, sterling. That was the cost of that. So if I'd given more notice, then I wouldn't have to pay that money. That's just the observation I'd make on that. And in terms of low-level light touch regulation, it's the same level of regulation. It's the same European regulation 261 that applies in all member states. So we all have to apply that. And as we said earlier on, in terms of dealing with the complaints or the claims that come through Ryanair's process and come to us, we will look at that with our European colleagues and take a harmonised approach to the treatment of the concerns that's raised by the passenger. So it's not that one person is letting Ryanair in one member state off the hook and in another country they're not, because that's the whole purpose. It's meant to be, as far as possible, a harmonised approach. And maybe Patricia wants to say a word or two before David, or maybe not. Do you have anything to add to that?
No, just in terms of that whole issue that you're talking about, the rerouting, the wording of the regulation doesn't expressly require an air carrier to reroute on other air carriers. But the thrust of the regulation, I suppose the spirit of the regulation has been commented on as being one where they would be very proactive. So it is very difficult water to navigate, and there's been debate at European level for 10 years and the clarity is still not there. So 10 years this has been a subject of discussion. So on that basis, we have been working with Ryanair over the period of the last number of years. Last year we met them on foot of the ATC disruption. I don't know if many of you remember how many flights were affected by that. That was mass disruption. And we met with them to discuss exactly how they were, I suppose, endeavouring to meet their obligations under Regulation 261 in that context. And we were very aware that they were looking beyond the word, the letter of the regulation in terms of the obligation to reroute air carriers, and they were building alliances with other air carriers for rerouting purposes. So that was in place. But the wording of the regulation is very technical, and it is, as I said, and has been a source of debate for 10 years.
Could I just respond to one of the points you made in relation to the compliance culture of Ryanair? Ryanair is a licensed air carrier in Ireland. It's also an approved ground handler. As with all of the other air carriers and ground handlers, the Commission engages in an annual monitoring exercise, and Ryanair is fully compliant with its air carrier licensing obligations and ground handling. And I think that's an important point to make here.
Absolutely, yeah. It's critical, actually, yeah. Sorry.
May I just clarify something, please,
yes,
on this line of question before we move away from the regulator? Yeah, sure.
Okay.
You see,
the regulator for safety.
If it's so well open to interpretation as you claim it is, then was it not the case that the CAA in Britain, Mr. Hayne, threatened legal action to enforce the regulation, and by the 5 o'clock deadline on whatever date it was, Ryanair complied? Now, knowing Ryanair as you do, and having earlier on made a comment about sometimes it's easier to work with them than have them revert to the law, do you not think it's strange that if it's so wide open to interpretation that they jumped into action and applied the regulation before the deadline? If it was that open to interpretation, wouldn't it be quite typical of Ryanair to go to court for the interpretation? It seems to me that Mr. Hayne had it right, that the ruling says that passengers should be informed that they have a right to be rerouted on other airlines.
As my colleague said to you there, this has been an area of debate over a number of years, and we are not suggesting at all that it's so open to interpretation. It's just that there are nuances there. And
if I could just add to that. This is the actual phraseology and the regulation regarding the rerouting is not one, the comparable transport conditions is not one that has yet been referred for clarification at the Court of Justice of the European Union. What has happened traditionally with the regulation is that areas which have been ambiguous and which have caused difficulty in terms of the application on the ground of the regulation, in many instances cases have been referred upwards to the CJU, and their ruling then becomes binding and is read in tandem with the legislation. That has not happened on this point, and in such time, when such a ruling is delivered, absolutely it will be read. But for now, it's a case of the enforcement bodies working harmoniously to ensure a consistent approach, notwithstanding the ambiguity applies.
Okay, I'll ask Captain O'Connor.
Yeah, in answer to Captain or to Deputy Barry's question on employment contracts, I have to say it's not the remit of the Irish Aviation Authority to review or look at employment contracts. That is for somebody else to do. I'll go forward. Pilots are very well trained and responsible people, and and as a body, they are highly recognised for their high standards of operation. Also, it is a pilot's responsibility. It's laid down in the rules that if he is tasked with a duty, he ensures he is fully fit to take part in that duty. And that's the responsibility that I have to see, that that pilot is fully responsible. And I haven't seen any trend or been notified in any way that pilots are turning up fatigued or in some other state to operate airplanes on behalf of any of our AOC operators. And with regard to the decision, as I have said, the Irish Aviation Authority wasn't informed. In fact, there's no reason for Ryanair to tell us what sort of changes they're making to their operation, be it small or large. And I know you have concerns that there's over 700,000 people involved in this. Of course everybody has concerns that these amount of people were displaced in some form or fashion. However, our remit is to ensure that the airline is compliant with the regulations. And we have a very robust audit programme in place to ensure that all our AOC operators are fully compliant with the regulations. And the robust audit programme that I refer to is based on the rule EU 965. And it's an area that is divided into 8 categories. It takes from the ground to the air to training to looking at flight time limitations, etc. So, like, I don't know what you mean by light touch. I have no comment on that. And I can only advise this Commission that Ryanair, that everybody is talking about, is fully compliant with all the regulations, both European and international. And I think that EASA, in its own statement, in its report from our March audit, would go along with that. With regard to pilot numbers, I've given the pilot numbers that we have for Ryanair. They have a ratio, a standard sort of industry ratio of over 5.2 crews per airplane. That covers the early mornings, the late mornings, the standby function, the sick leave and leave. So their planning of pilot or crew numbers is industry standard. With regard to the question on fuel and if we were aware of the list, I was aware of the list some years ago. That, I believe, that function that they were keeping a list on the usage of pilots' fuel has been terminated. That's my understanding.
Were you aware that it was handed to Minister Ross some time ago?
Absolutely not.
Minister Ross hasn't informed you about it?
Absolutely not.
He hasn't asked you about it?
No. And with regard to how fuel is managed, I mean, the Ryanair fuel policy is identical to the Aer Lingus fuel policy. In fact, at the time, in fact, I believe they use the same systems to calculate their fuel. I do know that pilots in Ryanair have to write on the voyage report. In other words, it's their way of understanding why extra fuel was carried because of their cost-orientated attitude to things. But they've been requested to write on a voyage report after they complete their assignment as to why they carried the extra fuel above a certain number. I think it's 300 kilos. I can't honestly remember.
Normal practice with every
Absolutely,
airline?
I would think every airline has it. It's got a click.
So
extra
every
fuel.
airline carries the minimum fuel?
I'm not saying that they carry minimum fuel. It's at the discretion of the captain, and the captain in Ryanair has discretion when it comes to fuel. In fact, the operations manual states that it's his decision as to how much fuel he carries.
You don't believe he comes under pressure from the airline to do that?
If asking him to write it in the voyage report is calling it under pressure, well, I don't know.
That's the pilots when they come in. But
Yeah.
I believe there is, and I believe there's a petition that was submitted to you to say that they felt pressurised. Is this correct?
Not in my time, in my position. Do you want to talk, Jimmy, on the...
Oh yeah, just on the question you raised with respect to the calendar year, that Regulation 83 came in 2016, so that had to be, all airlines had to be compliant.
My understanding is...
There were, I mentioned earlier, but there were all varying regulations in place prior to 2016. The new Regulation 83 was published in 2014. The airlines had to be compliant by 2016. Back in 2008, there were different regulations really across Europe. The UK had their own regulations and so on. And it was in the context of that Europe said, OK, look, let's have a common set of flight time limitations across the board. And that's where they published the legally binding flight time limitations in 2014 to be compliant in 2016.
So why was Ryanair given till January 2018 to be compliant?
Well, this is, and I'm really delighted you make that point. Is that well, it is no, and it is a valid question to ask. The regulation said in any calendar year, airlines had to comply with 900 hours in any calendar year. That's how the regulation was written. So we met with EASA, as I said again earlier, we met with EASA to discuss that element of the regulation. And in our discussions with EASA and the European Commission, they wanted to get to a situation where there was harmonisation across the board. Again, looking at the free movement of people between airlines, etc., it was advantageous that everybody should go to January to December calendar year. We agreed with that. We came back and then we instructed the airlines that had the April to March calendar year that they would have to become compliant. But we sat with them, we realised that there was a significant amount of work to achieve that, particularly for the larger airlines such as Ryanair. So yes, they did have pretty much from early 2016 right through to the deadline, which we agreed with them, and where we will impose is that from the 1st of January 2018, Ryanair will be compliant. Aer Lingus became compliant on the 1st of January 2017. Now, I do really want to make this other point, which I think is important, and you've made it again, Deputy Smith, is that there is some advantage in having an April to March calendar year, that you can work people harder during the summer months, etc. That is absolutely not true. There is a limitation which exists, and I mentioned it earlier again, of 100 hours of flight time in any 28 consecutive days. That is a restriction which is set in place to balance out the workload across the year. So you can't suddenly overwork people during the summer period because you have that restriction of 100 hours in any 28 consecutive days. So I really do want to make that point very strongly, because it has been made in various fora that this gives some advantage, etc., to airlines that had an April to March calendar year. So it doesn't have a safety implication, but what it does do by moving it to the January to December, it levels it all off, it creates harmonisation across Europe, it allows pilots to transfer, etc., across Europe. And I would make one final point in relation to it, if it's okay. The new regulations came in February 2016. EASA came over to us with an inspection team as part of a wide inspection. They wanted to see how we implemented the flight time regulations that were required to be implemented by February 2016. In March 2016, and I'll just read basically the line that they wrote in the report which they published, and they said, in the main strengths of the authority was, and I quote, well-managed transition to the new flight and duty times FTL requirements. That's EASA, the European Aviation Safety Agency, Having had all our discussions, they made that statement that we managed well the transition to the new flight and duty time requirements. I hope that answers your question, Deputy, but if you have follow-up.
Mr Courtney, it doesn't actually, because yesterday there was a plenary session in Strasbourg of dozens of very irate MEPs right across Europe, and the whole discussion was about Ryanair and how badly the transition has been managed. Now, that's Ryanair's problem, you might say, but then after all you are the authority that oversee this, so that doesn't add up for me. Neither does it add up to say that over 28 days you can only work 100 hours, because there's nothing stopping Ryanair scheduling their pilots to work. 28 days is approximately a month. So there's nothing stopping Ryanair scheduling their pilots to work April, May, June, July, and 6 months, of which is basically this, from Easter to the end of September, the summer period that they schedule their heavy-duty amount of flights into, and that the pilots work the bulk of their 900 hours within that 6 months. That'll be 600 hours. And then there's another 6 months to work 300, which is the max they can work in a year. So this kind of, what you're saying, doesn't add up to prove that there isn't a problem. And I did ask you if you're aware of the London School of Economic Study of 7,000 European pilots, where they specifically looked at pilot fatigue. And that should be of concern to you. And pilot fatigue is certainly of concern to me. I'm going over to the Climate Change Conference in Bonn in a couple of weeks. I'll be panicking about pilot fatigue now, having studied all this stuff. And you should be panicking, because you're the authority that has to oversee it. And therefore, there is a connection between the contracts that pilots receive and the state of their health when they're flying airplanes.
We are aware of the Ghent report, which I think you're referring to, and with respect to the contracts that pilots have, as Captain O'Connor has said, that is outside our remit. The contractual arrangements that operators or airlines have between their crews and the company is outside our remit. But I'll go back to the point again about the calendar year, because you're making some good points, but I just wanted to clarify with you. The peak summer months, generally speaking, are June, July and August. Generally speaking, in most airlines, it's June, July and August. Irrespective of whether the calendar starts in April or in January, those 3 months fall inside that same calendar year. So that's why I'm saying there is no, and if there was, we would obviously be onto it very quickly, there is no advantage in having an April to March calendar year over a January to December. Historically, most companies, and indeed our companies were the same, their financial year ran from April to March. So it kind of lined everything up in that sense. And that's how some airlines operated. But again, I say to you, there is no advantage in having an April to March calendar year.
Okay, thank you for that. And one final question for you, and it's to do with EASA and their response to the fact that Ryanair and Aer Lingus were the only two airlines in Ireland who were applying a different calendar year. My information is that every other country in Europe was applying the January to December year. So were EASA alarmed or concerned that there were two airlines here in Ireland and nowhere else that were applying this calendar year of April to March?
Well, I would say absolutely not. And again, I go back to the point, if EASA would have that concern, I doubt they would make the statement that we did a good transition across to the new regulations, if they had that concern. EASA did not raise any, because what EASA do, if they come in and do an inspection, they will raise what's called a finding against the authority. They did not raise any findings with respect to the calendar year in relation to the Irish Aviation Authority.
They weren't alarmed by it?
No, I really don't like that word alarmed. They weren't alarmed by it. We have regular communications with the agency, and we discuss all sorts of issues. And in this issue, we discussed it with them, we agreed with them, and then we came back and imposed the requirement of the January to December calendar year.
I'm sure they'd be choking on those words that you read out to me now, having seen the bags that was made of it.
Just to add to that, you know what I mean, we did this purely to harmonise pilots' flight time limitations within Europe. In other words, if a pilot wanted to go and work for Iberia, the same flight time limitations would be recorded from January to December. So we initiated this with EASA. EASA didn't enforce this on us. And in fact, the rule, as Captain Courtney has said any calendar year, and there was no breach or no misunderstanding of any Irish air operator as to what the rule was. And, you know, traditionally people have been using, the bigger airlines in Ireland have been using the calendar year from April to March purely to align with their financial year. And that's where it stems from. It doesn't stem from an advantage to operate, as you have suggested in your understanding of the rules.
That suggestion I just made, isn't it? Anyway.
Just before the witnesses go, Deputy Tribe would like to ask or say something there.
Make, I suppose, an observation that I'd be quite alarmed that there would be members of this committee would be suggesting that pilots would be compromising the safety in terms of passengers. I think we have to acknowledge that internationally the Irish Aviation Authority is renowned for the manner in which to conduct safety audits on all airlines across the board. And the airline industry is a very important industry to our economy, it's a very important industry to tourism, and it's worrying and concerning that people would be casting doubt over the safety concerns. We have people in before us today who have been internationally accredited as fourth in the world in terms of conducting and auditing from a safety perspective. I think the flight time limitations that has been implemented here is the same flight time limitations that are across every single airline industry in the world. And I think we want to be very careful to throw out and to raise concerns, while concerns should be raised if people have them, but to over-egg the situation. We have to take on board what people are saying in terms of the safety of the industry. It's a very important industry, and as my colleague has said, for people who wish to travel on airlines into the future, we shouldn't be raising their concerns unnecessarily.
I just say on that, and before I thank everybody, is that the facts are that Ryanair carry 131 million passengers per annum, and their safety record is absolutely top class. They've had no fatalities, and that's hugely important. And I just want to affirm also the professionalism of the regulators in the context of safety. And I have great, obviously you do a fantastic job. Obviously eternal vigilance is the price of peace, as they say, and I just thank you for that. And I'd like to, I know you've been going for what, 3 hours is it now, non-stop, so, but I want to thank you again. And if there are further issues that might arise, or perhaps I'd be interested in an analysis of the, you know, of the customer, the legal issues that you explained there, you know, how you can equate across Europe, you know, the way different regimes deal with passenger consumer rights. I think that's very important. And also the other point, which I won't bore you with today, but the question of, you know, is there a need for amalgamation of agencies? Is there a new role? Is there additional powers that you could have? You know what the future holds in relation to that. But thank you very much for your presentations and answering all of the questions here today. So we'll adjourn now for 5 p.m. If that's okay. We'll suspend till 5 p.m. and we'll have the pilots then. Thank you very much.